watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and a while back I received an email of a most thought-provoking, well-written sermon by a rabbi I have enormous respect for, which posed what might be called the Obama question, squarely before his congregation. The rabbi entitled his sermon, "Why This Rabbi Didn't Vote for Obama and Why I Made the Correct Decision." And I want to read to you the essence of that sermon. Here's what this rabbi said. Although I felt Barack Obama offered a measure of hope for our country, and although I felt the election of a black man as president of the United States would be one of the most positive and remarkable events to take place during my lifetime, and although I agreed with many parts of his domestic policies, it was his foreign policy views that concerned me and proved decisive. Israel is at the very heart of my family's existence. It was with this feeling uppermost in my mind that I chose not to vote for Barack Obama for president. That sermon was written by one of the leading pulpit rabbis in America, whose past sermons have been collected in a wonderful anthology called Pulpit Power. It's my pleasure to welcome back Mitchell Wohlberg, Orthodox Rabbi of Beth Tfilah Synagogue in Baltimore, Maryland. Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us
Good
again.
to be back, especially with that introduction.
You are making an extraordinary contribution in general, Mitchell, and so it's always wonderful when I can, sort of get you to sit in that seat as you come up from Baltimore. Thank you. So I received this email, and I read the sermon. I am just like everybody else. I am extremely impressed by it. By the way, when you delivered this sermon to your congregation, Beth Tfilah in Baltimore, what was the reaction?
When I finished the sermon for the first time in my rabbinic career, the congregation stood up and applauded.
Wow.
Yeah.
They stood up?
They stood up and applauded. Yeah.
Did it take you by surprise?
I've been wondering for years why they hadn't done it before, but obviously I had struck a responsive chord.
Yes.
Because we all understand most of the people in the congregation had certainly voted for Barack Obama for president.
You believe that to be true?
Oh, I would imagine in my congregation, it's a modern Orthodox congregation, I would say for sure 60-65%, I'm sure, voted for Barack Obama.
Are they in general Democrats?
Yes.
Okay.
Firstly, Maryland is a very democratic state. In fact, the U.S. Senator from Maryland, Ben Cardin, is a prominent member of the congregation and a regular worshiper. So certainly the congregation is what we would call democratic.
You heard me read the passage that I think is critical. I want to now say it again and ask the question that I believe it begs for some insight in. You felt before the election, during the election, Obama offered a measure of hope for our country. What does that mean?
I wasn't as critical of George Bush as most Americans seem to have been, but there obviously was a feeling that we need a change of direction. And Barack Obama certainly offered that. The very fact that he won the Democratic nomination over Hillary Clinton, who seemed to have been a shoo-in, was remarkable in and of itself. And his oratory and some of his ideas really did speak to a new chapter in the history of our people. There was a Kennedy mystique that was associated with him, and put the issue of race there I have long felt that race is one of the central divisive issues in the United States, long after school busing and voting rights and everything. Race is an issue. The idea of having a black man for president of the United States was, to me, absolutely mind-boggling. And I hate to say this because some people have criticized me for feeling this way. I almost would have voted for him on the basis of race. Because
what it would say about America.
What it would say about America and what it would say to our country.
Mm-hmm. And you do say that you felt the election of a black man as president would be one of the most positive and remarkable events of your lifetime.
Absolutely, unquestionably. I was a rabbi in Washington, D.C. before coming here. I lived in a very integrated neighborhood. The gentleman who lived next door to me, a black man, told me how he couldn't get his father buried in a government cemetery on the basis of race and was buried in a potter's field for all practical purposes. This was a proud man who had served as a Marine. That's the United States of America? No, that has to change. And here was the most significant step in that direction, from my perspective anyway.
Do you remember when he actually won the nomination and had that extraordinary night in Chicago?
Yes.
Did it move you at all?
Of course it moved me.
Of course it did.
I was proud to be an American. I was thrilled. I was excited. Then
you say that you also agreed with much of his social policies. What does that mean?
Generally, listen, I grew up in the typical Roosevelt Democratic home, and much of my thinking, certainly on social issues, is what I would call liberal-minded. I turned into the classic Jackson Democrat, the Hubert Humphrey Democrat, who is liberal on social issues, domestic issues, and more hawkish on foreign policy. And now they call such a person a neoconservative. I've been called worse.
So this is what I want to make sure our audience understands, that for Hope for America, for the thrill of what it would say about America for a black man to be elected, and because many of his domestic policies were ones that you endorsed and spoke for you, one might say to you, Mitchell, for all the issues relating to America, when it came time for Mitchell Wohlberg to vote for an American president in the United States of America, why wouldn't those issues drive the decision for you to support this candidate? But in fact, you argue that it was because Israel is more important to you. It was with this feeling that Israel is uppermost in my mind, that even though you thought Obama would be wonderful for America, for the host of reasons, you chose not to vote for him because he would be bad for Israel. And boy, this is somewhat rhetorical.
That's okay.
Why? I want you to explain why, in your mind, it was permissible for any American Jew, and you represent what many American Jews felt. Why is it permissible for an American Jew to say, I think Obama would be wonderful for America? But you know what? When it comes to my decision over who should be president of the United States, it turns out it's not about America. It's about Israel.
No, no.
What do you mean, no?
It's not simply a matter of Israel. It's a matter of, I and many others believe, we are engaged in a war. This is a war against Islamic radicalism. This is taking place all across the world. Israel is in the front line of that war. And Israel's security is a tripwire that relates to Iran, that relates to Middle East oil, that relates to Islamic extremism. We can survive differences on abortion, on Medicare. We can't survive an attack from Islamic extremism. And so I see Israel at the forefront of that battle. And so, yes, what's good for Israel is good for America, is good for Western civilization. Not that everything that Israel does is an act of genius, but it is at the forefront in a war that we have been fighting and we became aware of from 9/11, and that war has not stopped.
You don't mind if I push you?
Hard.
Okay, okay. This is not what your sermon said. If your sermon had said, I like Obama for all these reasons, but we are in a war with Islam, which trumps domestic issues, that would have been a different sermon. What you did say is, Israel is at the very heart of my family's existence.
Okay.
You communicated to your congregation that it was because Israel was more central than anything else.
So let me tell you something. In Florida, every candidate for every position makes sure to speak to the Cuban community about the issue of Cuba. That's very understandable, and nobody seems to find anything wrong with an understanding that there are Americans for whom the issue of Cuba is as significant as the issue of abortion, of Supreme Court. It's only when it comes to Israel that suddenly a foreign country gives raise to issues of dual loyalty.
I don't think that's fair. I'll tell you why.
Go ahead.
If there were a candidate in Florida who said what you said, namely, Cuba is more important to me than anything else, and therefore, although I like whatever the candidate is, my commitment to Cuba trumps it, there would be a problem for that individual. If, on the other hand, the Cuban said, I think that one of the things that I love about this candidate is that he supports Cuba, that is okay. But you, the way your sermon set this up, there was a whole host of things on one side, and then for you, no matter how you slice it, Israel trumped everything. And by the way, we're talking now on Shalom TV, and we've got an audience watching us, okay? And most of the audience feels what you and I feel, an overwhelming passion and loyalty to Israel.
I don't know if that's true.
Watching Shalom TV?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if a large element of the Jewish community feels the passion toward Israel that you and I feel. There is an element of your viewership that feels that passion, and that's the Christian community. I want to tell you an interesting thing, Mark. I received over 1,000 emails in the first week of the delivery of that sermon. And that sermon was reprinted on Jewish websites, on Christian websites. I would say the response, the positive response, it had to be at least 98%. But I could tell from reading an email whether it came from a Jew or whether it came from a Christian.
How?
For the most part, the Jews expressed their agreement with me because of their intense dislike for Barack Obama. The Christians expressed an agreement with me because of their intense love for the state of Israel.
So fascinating.
Fascinating, scary. Israel faces an existential threat to its very existence from Iran. Israel has absolutely no real tangible support from any place but the United States. The survival of Israel is dependent upon the support of the American government and the American people. I will be able to sleep well at night if it's a liberal or a conservative who's appointed to the Supreme Court. I will not be able to sleep if Israel is threatened and destroyed. And without the support of the United States, Israel's very survival is at stake.
Were you as comfortable with McCain's domestic policies?
I wasn't as comfortable with McCain's vice presidential candidate.
Okay, and that's not insignificant.
It's not insignificant.
Were you comfortable with McCain's domestic policies as you were with Obama's policies?
I was pretty comfortable. There could be some variations on the thing. I think that McCain is a man of integrity. I respect him immensely, and I don't think he's an ideologue. He's not some flaming right-winger that comes out of Fox News.
All right. Again, I'm just trying to understand the extent to which you really, in this sermon, may have misstated one aspect of the case. It may have been that you felt McCain was good for this country, and that even if Obama had been good for Israel, you would not have voted for Obama. You make it sound like everything you liked about Obama except his stand on Israel.
Yeah, if you try and analyze it like that, in retrospect, when I look back on it, perhaps all of the nice things I said about Mr. Obama was to pull them in.
Maybe.
Because I want to tell you something, Mark. His policies, yeah, I admired a lot of the policies. I had a tremendous reservation about the fact that the man is totally inexperienced.
Okay, and you don't really write about that.
But that's not what this sermon is about.
Right, and I'm saying again that the reason why this fascinated me so much, why? Because Mitchell Wohlberg has put his finger on an issue that has suddenly, again, its head has arisen. The issue of Jewish dual loyalty. Are Jews who are here in America, as much as they love this country, participate in it? Is it in the bottom, when you finally get to the bottom of it all? Are there Jews who, as much as they love this country, will make decisions affecting the future of this country domestically or internationally outside of Israel, based not on what they think is good for America, but on what they think is good for Israel? Does Israel drive Jewish decisions, as opposed to American interests driving American decisions in an American election? And what you have said here is, and I'll quote it again, Israel is at the very heart of my family's existence. And therefore, when it came time for you to vote for president, although it now seems like you were more comfortable with McCain than the sermon may have suggested, and less comfortable with Obama for other reasons, as nice as you made it sound, that the worry is, the question you raised, which I wanted you to discuss, is what would you advise the Jew in general? A Jew says to you, I think this guy would be great for America, but he doesn't get the Middle East. He somehow thinks that the Israeli settlement issue is why we don't have peace in the Middle East. That he has to make nice to Palestinians who will not recognize the state of Israel's right to exist. What do I do, Rabbi Wahlberg? Do I vote for the man who I think will be good for this country, or do I vote for the man that I think will be better for Israel, even if I feel that on other issues, Supreme Court nominations, health care, gun control, abortion rights, and a tone for the country, I don't think he'll be as good as Obama or as good as this other man, but he will be better on Israel. Would Mitchell Wohlberg say, vote for the man because he would be good for Israel, or do you say you've got to go with the man who would be good for America?
You're drawing a picture that is so black and is so white that it's really hard to give an answer. But let me just say the following. In terms of a dual loyalty, in terms of the United States and in terms of Israel, first of all, you said before, I'm participating in America. I am not participating in America. I am an American citizen and extremely proud of it. And you go through my sermons, you're not going to find criticism of America. This is the greatest country on earth, and there's never been a country that has been as good to the Jewish people as America. That's number one. Number two, I have a dual loyalty. And there's no question about that. I'm loyal to my mother, and I'm loyal to my father.
Your mother and father don't normally disagree.
Obviously, you did not know my mother and father.
No, sir. Don't be, I don't. This is serious.
I'm serious.
Give me an example over principle where your mother and father disagreed. I don't mean what to eat for dinner. I don't know what movie to go to. Tell me over principle. Most of us grew up in a home where the mother and the father had shared values.
Tell me in principle where the United States and Israel don't see eye to eye.
You believe Obama doesn't get it.
I believe Obama doesn't get it. This is not an issue simply of the United States and Israel. This is an issue of his entire policy of engagement with the Islamic world, an engagement for which we have absolutely nothing to show for it. And there has been a change in his policy, and I believe it's not because of my sermon. I believe because he realizes the policy was not good for the United States.
You wanted to make a point.
And I
Your
did.
point was, I don't care how good Obama would have been for America. He was not good for Israel.
Excuse me.
And Israel trumps it in your mind.
There is nothing in that sermon that says, I don't care. I spoke about the positive aspects that I think Mr. Obama would have brought to the presidency. But I was speaking in terms of setting a tone for the point I was trying to make. The point I was trying to make was not who I voted for, but what we are dealing with now, and that we have a serious issue in terms of the president's approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now remember, this was given several months ago.
I know.
The sermon would not be the same today.
Much has changed since you did the sermon.
All in the direction of which I've spoken for.
That's
now,
true.
He
That's
didn't,
true.
He didn't do that because of Israel. He didn't do that because of the Jewish lobby. He did that because of a recognition that the policy he was pursuing was only making the Palestinians more intransigent, that there was nothing to show for engagement from Iran or from Syria or any other Islamic countries, that the terrorism was continuing across the globe and it's all Islamic terrorism. There was a recognition that the policy that he was espousing was not working. More credit to him. And I want to tell you something. There are a lot of Jews who say, no, he hasn't changed. It's all because of the election.
Yes, many people claim it's a political decision.
Okay, so I want to tell you something. First of all, Jews are taught in the ethics of the Father that we should judge everybody on the scale of merit. I'm prepared to give the man the benefit of the doubt. Mm-hmm. Number two, we'll know after the election. We'll see what his policy is. I have no reason to believe that it's going to change. And third, I want to tell you something. I don't question people's motives, because I do a lot of good things, but I have to be honest. Don't tell this to anybody on camera. Can't say that I'm always motivated by the most idealistic. Mm-hmm. Whatever it was, he's come to a more realistic approach, I believe, towards the Middle East, and not just simply toward the Middle East.
But now I do want you to come back to the theoretical question, even if it's not what you were trying to convey here. I want you to imagine you're talking to somebody at Beth Tfilah Synagogue, your congregation, who feels he or she has this dilemma, that she does feel, or he does feel, a candidate would be really good for the United States, but would not be good in foreign policy as it affects Israel. Israel alone. Would you say...
Mark, that's the... You cannot say Israel and Israel alone. Israel is part of a bigger picture in the world in which we're living. We're living in a world of Islamic extremism. What Israel is having to deal with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with Hamas in Gaza, with Iran. This is part of a big picture that is... The jury is out on this war that a lot of people want to make believe doesn't exist.
Are you basically saying to me that the dichotomy and the tension between interests as they apply to the United States and interests as they apply to Israel is really a false dichotomy, that it can't exist?
I do believe it's a false dichotomy. I will not say that it can't exist. There's obviously some elements of Israeli policy that the United States finds that it's not in their best interest. And, you know, the way you make it, Mark, when you say would be bad for America but would be good for Israel versus would be good for Israel and be... I want to tell you something. Anybody who would be bad for America, it's going to be bad for Israel. Because if America doesn't have the stature and the respect that it has, that it needs to have in this world, in a world where Europe has really turned inside itself, is giving in to Islamic fundamentalism in their own countries, have no idea how to deal with it. Where I'm reading in England, the second most popular name is Mohammed, after Jack. In Brussels, it might be the first most popular name. The world needs the United States to be strong. So obviously, I'm not going to vote for someone that's not good for this country. Because if he's not good for this country, he ain't good for me.
I think you say it perfectly. And I'll tell you now my larger problem, and you can, this is rabbi to rabbi now. I am concerned that rabbis give the wrong message. The message you express here, I'm very comfortable with. But I think there are times when rabbis would like to suggest to their congregations, to their audience, that it is a decision between America or Israel, and that in those instances, the Jew should vote for Israel. What you've said is much more subtle and sophisticated, that you do have a very difficult time imagining, and I think you're probably right, a situation where somebody would be really good for America and bad for Israel.
Right.
Right. What you've said basically is there are international issues which touch upon Israel, but they're international issues which will affect the way that America is perceived, its standing in the world, will affect policies that are international in scope, which Israel might be included in, but it's not about Israel itself.
Absolutely.
And I'm saying to you that I think there are some times when rabbis try to create the notion among their congregants that Israel should be the most important issue, period. And that if there is a conflict, it should be Israel over even other American interests.
I suspect that there are rabbis like that, but I also know that there are rabbis who would say that gay rights and a position on abortion is more important than a candidate's position towards Israel. We are talking, when we're talking about Israel, we are talking about half of the Jews in the world living in Israel. Their security goes to the very heart of my existence. I am part of the Jewish people. You're talking about the security of half of the Jewish people. 1 generation ago, we lost 1/3 of our people, and they've never been replaced. We can't afford another such loss. And so if I have to come out one way or the other, I am going to come out in support of what I believe is the best interests of the security of the State of Israel. And I believe that the security of the State of Israel should be decided by the people of Israel. I don't accept American Jews as being critics of Israel's security policies because we don't live there. We don't know how it feels not simply to have our child go fighting in the army. Children today in Israel, when they're born, they get the same baby powder and the same diapers that they get in the United States and a little gas mask. Israel is the first country that has built gas masks for infants. Now, if I was a parent and I have this new child, and I'm looking at this child, and I have to give this child, and I have to measure the child for a gas mask, what would I say to myself? That we're confronting an enemy that is capable of gassing this child, and so I better not compromise 1 inch. If they're capable of doing that, they can't be trusted for anything. Or I might say, listen, in a world like this, what is a little more territory, another settlement, or another compromise? We've got to do, give it all in just to put an end to this battle so that we shouldn't have to worry about some threats. How would you feel? There's no way of knowing because you're not there and it's not your kid. And so I feel that the security of Israel has to be left to the people of Israel to decide what's in their best interest. And I have to hope that the United States is going to be supportive of those decisions. Now, Mark, I have to remind you, the Bush administration, they were no fans of settlements. Settlements has been against American policy almost from the time of the beginning of the settlements. Mr. Obama made it the #1 first issue that had to be dealt with without asking anything from the Palestinians. The only thing he asked was some conciliatory responses from the Arab countries, none of which he received. And I'm supposed to keep quiet?
No, you're not supposed to keep quiet. You know, and again, I find myself in an awkward position because as an intellectual issue, not as a real issue, I find it important for American Jews to confront the very topic we're discussing. As a rabbi, as a Jew, as an American, I believe it's critical that America support Israel. Critical. It is only when the dichotomy is set up, the either or, that I become uncomfortable. And it's one thing for you to say everything you've said, stam. You say it as eloquently as I've heard anybody say it. You should be national all the time. But in this sermon, you basically said Obama was terrific for America, but my heart is with Israel. And here in this discussion, you have made it much more sophisticated.
If you heard it that way or read it that way, which I can understand, next time I'll do better.
Okay, you don't believe me. You are a master at it.
No, I understand.
And I wanted to hear what Mitchell Wohlberg would say, not about the sermon, but about this more general issue. And I'll tell you also why. It's something I hear now all the time. I'm hearing from Jews all the time now, especially Jews who are critical of those who criticize Obama. Jews who are critical of Jews, critical of Obama, try to make this into, where is your heart? Is your heart with the needs of America, with the health care, and with creating a social order here, going for the change, going for the election of the first black person, which was thrilling to both of us, despite any misgivings we might have had about Obama.
Mark,
And I hear this now all the time from what is normally called the Jewish left. And in the past, I shouldn't say in the past, for many, many, many years, not since Nixon, by the way, have I heard this issue discussed the way it's being discussed now in the Jewish community. And I wanted Mitchell Wohlberg to address the larger issue, not simply the sermon.
Let me tick off the left, and then let me tick off the right. The criticism that's coming from the left frequently, and I don't want to make one of these blanket statements, they themselves say they're disengaging from Israel.
That's correct.
Their problem is not with the criticism of Obama. Their problem for many of them is their attitude toward Israel. The Israeli policies are going against their liberal humanitarian perspective. They're wrong. They're entitled to their opinion, but be honest about what's motivating you. the right has to be honest also. And here I'm going to say something that, take it for what it's worth. There is racism. And I saw it in the emails that I got from Jews in response to my sermon. Emails that were supportive of my criticism of Obama. But you couldn't help but note that their criticism had racial overtones to them. I'm sorry to say it, but, you know, if we're not going to be honest, we're never going to solve the problem. There's a racial issue in the Jewish community. There's a racial issue in the general community. And we're kidding ourselves if we think that we're immune to it.
Since we're talking, by the way, what is Mitchell Wohlberg's position on the two-state solution?
It's the only solution. It's the only solution. But the real problem is they've never accepted it. Mm-hmm. From the Balfour Declaration to the Peel Commission to the UN vote to 1967 to today. You know, everybody speaks about Israel as being intransigent, uncompromising, militaristic. And it's the other guys who refuse to sit down and talk. Because they haven't really made their peace with the two-state solution. As long as they talk about we're going to have the West Bank and Gaza and the right of return, they're talking about a one-state solution. It's as simple as that. And Israel is not going to move until they know for a fact that the Arabs have, in fact, accepted the two-state solution.
I want to take a half a step back.
Go.
You spoke beautifully about the importance of American Jewry respecting Israel's right to make certain decisions for itself.
Absolutely.
I want to tell you what Jeremy Ben-Ami has said, who, of course, is the executive director of
J
Street. And his point is that what Israel does impacts the way in which American Jews are viewed and treated in the United States. That if Israel is seen to be an aggressive, oppressive occupier in the West Bank, it colors the way American non-Jews view these Jews. And Jeremy Ben-Ami's argument is, therefore, American Jews have a right to participate in these discussions because it is artificial to say that only Israel is at risk or only Israel is affected by the decisions Israel makes.
It's a lot of garbage. There's no question about it. The overwhelming majority of the American people support the state of Israel, support the policies of the state of Israel. And that's not because of a Jewish lobby. That's because the American people have a strong sense of right and wrong, feel that Israel is fighting the battle against extremism, and I'm sorry to say, have clearer thinking than Jeremy Ben-Ami, and I can't worry about what the person at the water cooler in his office is going to think about him, depending upon how the Israelis are forced to act. Where I feel that American Jews do have a say in regard to Israel policy is on policies that directly concern them in terms of their identity, the who's a Jew, the conversion issues. That has an effect on identifying me and you and every other Jew. America, there we have, say, security. Sorry, Jeremy, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen.
In your view, has Barack Obama now significantly changed U.S. policy vis-a-vis Israel? And many people had felt at one time that Obama's intention was to force Israel to make compromises, whether they were good for Israel or not, for the sake of this theoretical peace. Do you feel, after his meeting most recently with Netanyahu, that there's a difference or not?
I felt it before the meeting. There wouldn't have been the meeting, and it certainly wouldn't have been as cordial. There's no question. The previous president was a tremendous friend of Israel, George Bush. The previous president, Clinton was a tremendous friend of Israel, but they had different policies towards Israel. You can be a friend toward Israel while disagreeing, but where you're putting your thumb and where you're putting the emphasis makes all the difference in the world. Barack Obama has switched where he's putting his thumb and where he's putting his emphasis, and I honestly believe that it's because he sees the policy he started with was not working. Not simply in terms of Israel, but in terms of the Arab world.
You touched a moment ago on an area which you do feel American Jews have a right to express themselves, and that is how Israel defines who is a Jew. And we've just had this flack over the Rotem conversion bill, which you might disagree with me, I feel was very much mischaracterized by the Anglo-Jewish press and by some well-meaning Jewish leaders whose real goal had nothing to do at the moment with anything that impacted how we practice our Judaism in America. But I will ask this because you are an Orthodox rabbi of a modern Orthodox congregation. The real issue is, should there be Jewish pluralism in the state of Israel? Should there be a recognition by the state that conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism, Reconstructionist Judaism have an authenticity to the extent that non-Orthodox rabbis, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, would have the power, which they don't have now, to marry, to bury, to convert? What is your feeling in general, Mitchell, about pluralism in the state of Israel?
Simply put, get the rabbis out of politics. They don't belong there. Plain and simple. We've lost a generation of Jews in Israel, Jewishly, because of the involvement of the rabbis in politics. The very idea that there are religious political parties is doomed to failure and to conflict. And there's going to be different definitions of who is a Jew and so on and so forth, and the definition for a passport need not be the same of the definition that's going to be issued from out of my office. It's horrible, the situation, Mark. And this is not simply an issue of the Orthodox, let me put it to you like this, out of a close friend, a Reform rabbi in Baltimore. His son had served in the army in Israel and was getting married in Israel. He needed a letter ascertaining that his son is Jewish. So he needed me, an Orthodox rabbi, to write the letter. His son had served in the Israeli army. He was a Reform rabbi who has made marvelous contributions to the Jewish world. And he needed me to write the letter that his son is Jewish. But it's changed now, because now a lot of rabbis in Israel won't accept my letter either.
You're not Jewish enough.
That's what happens. Once you start that game, there's a slippery slope that none of us are good enough.
You are marvelous in every way. I love talking to you. I love the opportunity to present you to our audience. I can't thank you enough for giving us time. And you've already promised me you're going to come back. We're going to do some Torah together. I can bring you together with other Jews. And anytime there's an issue of real delicacy in the Jewish community, your voice should be heard, and I can't thank you enough,
I appreciate that, but I want to tell you something, Mark. This is a positive experience for me. The way you read some of my words obviously was not my intention, and I have to be aware of that, because my words no longer are simply held within the confines of a congregation that generally knows where I am coming from. It's much broader than that. It can't be much broader than being on television. I thank you for the opportunity.
Mitchell Koltu,
Thanks a lot.
you just do wonderful work. Thank you.
Thanks.
And those were the thoughts of Rabbi Mitchell Wohlberg, Rabbi of Beth Tfilah Synagogue in Baltimore, Maryland. I hope you enjoyed hearing him and that he's made you think. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to the ideas expressed by Mitchell Wohlberg. And if you want to be in touch with him, you can always do so through me. Please email me or write me this week. I look forward to hearing from many of you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.